Episode 25. Was the West African slave trade a precondition for the rise of British capitalism? An AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Today, we're looking at one of the biggest historiography debates connected to the Industrial Revolution. How connected was Britain's industrial growth to the Atlantic slave trade and plantation slavery? When people picture industrialization, they usually imagine factories, steam engines, and coal mines. But historians have also asked where the investment capital, trade networks, and overseas markets behind industrialization actually came from. Dr. Morgan, Professor Theo, thanks for being here.
Glad to be here, Miles. This debate pushes historians to think about industrialization in a global context rather than treating Britain like it developed in isolation.
And it forces historians to confront the contradiction that the same Britain associated with Enlightenment ideas and economic progress was also deeply tied to slavery and coerced labor throughout the Atlantic world.
So this whole debate is basically built around what historians call the Williams thesis, right?
Exactly. The debate largely comes from a historian named Eric Williams, whose 1944 book Capitalism and Slavery argued that slavery and the profits connected to the Atlantic economy helped finance Britain's Industrial Revolution. He also argued that Britain eventually abolished slavery not primarily for moral reasons, but because slavery had become less economically useful.
Which sounds pretty controversial.
Extremely controversial. Williams challenged an older story that portrayed Britain as the heroic birthplace of industrial progress and humanitarian reform. Instead, he argued that modern capitalism and slavery developed together.
Before we get into the historians arguing about this, I think we probably need some background. Dr. Morgan, when people at the time talked about mercantilism, were they basically treating colonies like sources of income?
In many ways, yes. Mercantilism was the dominant economic philosophy of most European governments during the 17th and 18th centuries. The goal was to increase national wealth and state power by controlling trade, accumulating precious metals, and maintaining a favorable balance of trade. Colonies existed largely to benefit the mother country.
Mercantilist thinkers viewed colonies less as communities and more as economic assets. Colonies supplied raw materials and purchased manufactured goods from Europe. The system was designed to keep wealth flowing back to the imperial center.
And Britain's Atlantic Empire became especially important within that system. Caribbean sugar colonies generated enormous wealth. Plantation economies in Jamaica and Barbados relied on enslaved labor to produce sugar, tobacco, rum, and later cotton for European markets.
And Britain became heavily involved in the slave trade itself?
Very heavily involved. In the late 17th century, the English crown chartered the Royal African Company, which held a monopoly over much of England's trade along the West African coast. The company established forts and trading posts in Africa and transported enslaved Africans across the Atlantic.
So the government was directly involved?
Absolutely. The slave trade was closely tied to state power, naval protection, and imperial rivalry. This wasn't just private merchants acting independently. The British state viewed Atlantic commerce as strategically important.
And many contemporaries openly said so. Writers like Malachy Postlethwaite argued very directly that slavery increased British prosperity and naval power. He described the slave trade as essential to Britain's commercial success.
Which is kind of horrifying because it seems like they have forgotten they are talking about other people.
Exactly. One of the disturbing parts of reading these sources is how normalized slavery had become in elite economic thinking. These writers often discussed enslaved Africans in purely economic language. They viewed the slave trade as a mechanism for national expansion.
And this becomes even clearer after the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. Britain gained what was called the Asiento, a 30-year contract giving Britain the right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies in the Americas.
Dr. Morgan, was the Asiento considered a big geopolitical victory at the time?
Very much so. British leaders viewed it as a major commercial breakthrough after the War of the Spanish Succession. The contract expanded British access to Atlantic markets and strengthened British influence within the wider imperial economy. From the perspective of British policymakers, it was both an economic and strategic success.
And again, What's striking is how openly people celebrated this. They linked slavery to shipping, manufacturing, banking, naval power, and imperial dominance.
So even before historians started debating this, people living during the 18th century already believed slavery was important to Britain's economy.
Precisely. That's one reason this debate became so important. Historians began asking whether these 18th century writers were exaggerating or whether they actually understood something fundamental about the rise of British capitalism.
Okay, so now we get to Eric Williams.
Right. Williams argued that the profits from slavery and plantation economies contributed significantly to Britain's industrial growth. His argument was broader than just saying slave traders got rich. He claimed the entire Atlantic system helped fuel industrial capitalism.
Williams also shifted attention away from purely technological explanations for industrialization. He wanted historians to recognize that industrial growth occurred within a global system, built partly on colonial exploitation and coerced labor.
So historians aren't arguing about whether slavery made money. They're arguing about whether it mattered enough to help drive industrialization.
Exactly. Almost everyone agrees the slave trade generated profits. The disagreement is about scale and influence. Did those profits fundamentally matter to industrialization, or were they relatively minor compared to other economic developments happening inside Britain?
Why did that argument make so many historians upset?
Because it challenged national myths. Britain often portrayed itself as the nation that pioneered liberty, constitutional government, and industrial progress. Williams forced historians to confront the possibility that modern prosperity was tied to slavery. That was deeply uncomfortable for many people.
And this also connects to abolition, right?
Yes. Williams argued Britain abolished slavery only after it became less economically valuable. But later historians debated that too.
And there's an important detail students should understand here. When Britain abolished slavery in most of the empire in 1833, the British government compensated slave owners for the loss of what they considered property.
Wait, Britain paid slave owners to end slavery?
Yes. The British government paid about £20 million in compensation, which amounted to roughly 40% of the annual national budget at the time. The government borrowed heavily to finance those payments.
40%? That's massive.
It also tells us how deeply slavery was embedded within Britain's financial system. The government treated slave ownership as economically significant enough to require enormous compensation.
And the formerly enslaved people got nothing.
Correct. The enslaved received no compensation whatsoever. In fact, many were forced into apprenticeship systems that continued coercive labor practices even after formal emancipation.
And the debt from those compensation payments lasted an incredibly long time. Britain only fully finished paying off the debt connected to abolition in 2015.
That's honestly hard to wrap my head around. So technically, a British person today whose family descended from enslaved people could have been paying taxes that helped pay off the debt used to compensate slave owners for their ancestors' freedom?
In a broad sense, yes. That's part of why historians emphasize that slavery is not simply ancient history sealed off in the past. The financial systems, institutions, and inequalities connected to slavery continued shaping modern societies long after emancipation.
And that example also shows why this debate matters beyond just economics. We are talking about systems whose effects lasted for generations.
Exactly. It reminds us that slavery wasn't some distant or disconnected institution. Its financial consequences extended deep into modern history.
Okay, so where does William Darity come into all of this?
Darity is one of the historians who builds on and defends key parts of the Williams thesis. He argues historians have often minimized or ignored the economic importance of slavery.
Darity criticizes what he sees as a kind of historical silence surrounding slavery's role in industrialization.
What does he actually argue?
One major issue involves what historians call the small ratios argument. Some economic historians argued that profits from the slave trade were too small relative to Britain's total national income to have significantly affected industrialization.
Basically saying the numbers weren't big enough to matter?
Exactly. But Darity argues this misunderstands how early industrial economies worked. Even relatively small amounts of concentrated investment capital could have enormous effects during the early stages of industrialization.
Darity also argues historians focus too narrowly on direct slave trade profits. He says the larger Atlantic system mattered more broadly.
So Darity's argument is kind of that slavery mattered because it connected a bunch of different parts of the economy together?
That's a very good way to put it. Darity emphasizes interconnected systems. He points to the growth of ports like Liverpool and Bristol, the rise of insurance industries, banking networks, shipping infrastructure, and manufacturing tied to Atlantic commerce.
He also notes that Caribbean plantations created major export markets for British manufactured goods. British textiles, metal goods, and tools circulated through the Atlantic trading system.
Darity even highlights connections between slavery and institutions students still recognize today. Barclays and Lloyd's both had historical ties to wealth connected to the slave economy.
So the argument isn't just slave traders made money, it's that the entire Atlantic economy helped stimulate British capitalism.
Exactly. Darity argues plantation slavery became integrated into Britain's broader system of industrial and commercial expansion.
He also points out that human suffering can disappear inside economic statistics. If historians only look at percentages of national income, they may overlook how dependent economic systems became on coerced labor.
So is part of this debate just historians looking at the same problem in different ways?
Very much so. Some historians focus heavily on measurable profitability. Others emphasize structural relationships between empire, labor, finance, and industrial growth.
So what's the argument from the other side?
James Raleigh represents a more skeptical position. He argues historians have often exaggerated both the profitability of the slave trade and its importance to industrialization.
He's basically pushing back against the Williams thesis?
Yes, though importantly, Raleigh is not defending slavery. He fully recognizes the brutality and significance of the Atlantic slave system. His argument is specifically about economic scale.
That distinction matters. Historians can agree slavery was morally catastrophic, while disagreeing about how central it was to industrial capitalism.
So what does Raleigh say?
Raleigh argues the slave trade was risky, expensive, and inconsistent. Ships faced disease, mortality, piracy, war, insurrection, and major insurance costs. Some voyages made profits, but others lost money.
So those huge stories about slave traders getting unbelievably rich might be exaggerated?
According to Raleigh, yes. He argues many earlier historians oversimplified the accounting. Some calculations ignored operating costs or combined profits from multiple forms of trade.
Raleigh also challenges the simplified image of the triangular trade. In reality, Atlantic commerce was often more complicated and irregular than textbook diagrams suggest.
That's interesting because the triangle trade diagram makes it look really clean and organized.
Historically, it was far messier. Some ships returned without cargo. Others operated through complicated credit systems rather than direct exchange.
And Raleigh also says the profits themselves were smaller?
Generally, yes. He argues profits from the slave trade were often comparable to ordinary commercial investments rather than extraordinary engines of wealth. He points out that slave trade profits usually represented a very small percentage of Britain's total national income.
So Raleigh isn't defending slavery. He's arguing historians have exaggerated its economic impact?
Exactly.
So this is partly an argument over how big slavery's economic impact actually was?
Very much so. Historians are debating whether slavery was central or supplementary. Was it foundational to industrialization, or just one factor among many?
And Raleigh argues Britain's industrialization depended more heavily on factors like coal deposits, agricultural improvements, domestic markets, population growth, and technological innovation.
Even if slavery wasn't the main cause of industrialization, it could still be hugely important historically, right?
Absolutely. Historical significance isn't always about being the single most important cause. Slavery shaped millions of lives, transformed Atlantic societies, and generated enormous imperial wealth, even if historians disagree about precisely how much it contributed to industrial capitalism.
It sounds like both sides actually agree on some things.
They do. Most historians today agree Britain benefited enormously from empire and Atlantic trade. The disagreement is really about degree and causation.
Historians also disagree because capitalism itself is difficult to define. Are we talking about factories, investment systems, global trade networks, financial institutions, colonial markets? Depending on the definition, slavery may appear more or less central.
And historians today also have access to better data than historians had decades ago.
Yes, quantitative history, computer databases, shipping records, and economic modeling have all changed the debate. Some historians believe newer data weakens Williams's claims. Others believe it strengthens them.
And broader historical trends matter too. Modern historians increasingly study Atlantic history and global connections, rather than treating European history as isolated from the wider world.
Which honestly makes sense. Britain didn't industrialize in a vacuum.
Exactly. Industrialization was tied to empire, global trade, naval power, colonial markets, and labor systems stretching across the Atlantic world.
One thing that stands out to me is how much bigger this makes the Industrial Revolution feel. It's not just factories and inventions inside Britain. It's also connected to plantations, ships, empire, and slavery across the Atlantic world.
That's why this historiography matters. It forces historians to ask who paid the human cost of economic transformation.
And it reminds us that historical change rarely has a single cause. Britain industrialized because of many overlapping developments. The debate is about how heavily slavery should weigh among them.
All right, let's wrap things up there. Today we looked at the Atlantic slave trade, mercantilism, the Royal African Company, the Asiento, and the debate over whether slavery helped create the foundations for British industrial capitalism. We talked about Eric Williams's argument, William Darrady's defense of the broader Atlantic system, and James Raleigh's criticism that the profits from slavery have often been exaggerated. Next episode, we'll look at how marriage, family life, and attitudes toward childhood were changing in 18th century Europe. Thanks for listening to The Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions.